Hello everyone, and welcome to the Eve Reader podcast. My name is Zendane, and this is episode 1. Today I'll be reading the story Xenocracy. Planetary Administrator Leonol Yvesque's assistant, a much younger Galente woman named Colossa, trotted up and matched his pace as he disembarked from the passenger tram. Yvesque sighed vocally. As they made their way up the ramp to street level, flowing along with a crowd of other laborers and urban professionals commuting to work during the morning hours, she remained silent. Only when they had merged into the open and separated from the majority of the other pedestrians did she venture to initiate conversation. "Good morning," she began. "I hope you're well today." She had a polite but submissive demeanor he usually appreciated. It had taken him almost 50 years to climb to his position as the highest authority on Chesiet Prime, the first planet of the Chesiet system, a thriving temperate world with just over 1 billion inhabitants. Because of its position near the border between the Galente Federation and the Amar Empire, the planet was important, on paper. In reality, the efficiency of Federation politics, combined with their peace-oriented foreign policy, had rendered many of his duties unnecessary, resulting in his being regarded by many officials as a glorified middle manager instead of a frontier diplomat. Today, however, he found her meek, subservient manner frustrating. He was on his way to a meeting he had been dreading all month, one that he had no experience with, and despite the fact that this was finally a duty in line with his diplomatic training, he was exceedingly nervous. "What is it, Colossa?" "I have the report you asked for on carbon compound dispersion patterns on the southern continents." She fumbled with a small case as they walked, almost colliding with several people moving in the opposite direction. Yvesque stared straight ahead as he walked. "Very good." Frowning, Colossa tucked the case back under her arm and hustled to keep up with him. "Can I ask why you seem so upset, Administrator Yvesque?" She didn't wait for him to reply before adding, "Does it have something to do with the capsuleer?" Yvesque stopped abruptly and grabbed her arm, drawing a startled look from his young assistant. He glanced around and shot dirty looks at all the people watching, their attentions instantly focused on the two after the last word she had spoken aloud. "I think it would be best," he hissed, "if we kept such topics in private discussion." When he was certain that his point had been made, as was evident by the paleness of her face, he released her and stormed off. Nodding quickly, Colossa averted her eyes. From that point until they arrived at the conference building, she stayed a step behind the administrator, absolutely silent. Seated in the largest chair in the observation room, Yvesque took a few moments to make sure his suit's collar was perfect before nodding to Colossa, who was seated at a nearby holographic interface. She ran one hand over the console's horizontal sensor, prompting the air above it to waver and coalesce into a digital readout. Reaching up and tracing one finger across the insubstantial surface of the screen, she selected the proper communications channel and turned to look at the far wall, which went entirely black, save for the blinking symbol in one corner that indicated a connection was waiting for authorization. When an image finally appeared, it caught the administrator off guard. The capsuleer was clearly of Amar descent, with high cheekbones and a clean-shaven scalp. But beyond the most obvious features, little of his face could be discerned. Most of his head was obscured by cybernetic implants, curved, metallic attachments that spread across his skull at every angle, completely concealing his eyes, nose, and mouth. Power and information cables stretched from each implant to somewhere off-camera on either side, making it seem like he was suspended in a spider web instead of seated comfortably in a starship in orbit high above the planet. It was only a simulation, an image that this person chose to portray of themselves, but it thoroughly unnerved Yvesque. He caught himself staring at the screen and covered his blunder by clearing his throat and introducing himself. "Greetings, I am Planetary Admin
Leonol Yvesque,"
interrupted a thundering voice, reverberating across the room with an unearthly tone. The camera displaying the man on the screen zoomed in to show only the head and shoulders, his body twitching subtly whenever he spoke.
"I am familiar with your information."
Yvesque inhaled briefly, scratched the side of his head, then gestured to Colossa and offered, "This is my assistant, Cole."
"Your associates are not my concern."
Interpreting the capsuleer's body language was impossible. After several moments of uncomfortable silence, the muscles on his neck convulsed briefly. It really was an unnerving illusion, and the speakers continued his statement.
"I am Vistus."
The administrator nodded respectfully. His assistant continued to stare at the vid screen and chew on her bottom lip absent-mindedly. When it became obvious by the elongated pause in the conversation that the capsuleer wasn't going to finish his introduction by clarifying whether the name he offered was first or last, Yvesque moved on to business. "As you can see, sir, we are fully prepared to begin implementing your production schedule. Our industrial sector still needs some updates and modifications, but I'm confident that in just under a year we could—"
"That is too long."
The expressionless face on the screen twisted slightly, and then the capsuleer's voice boomed through the speakers.
"I will replace your industrial sector immediately. You have 1 hour to evacuate all personnel before the new facilities arrive in their place."
Ivesk paled visibly as he turned his head slowly to Kolasa, who lunged for the nearest control panel and began sending out frantic messages. "We're making preparations immediately, sir. Perhaps if you could—"
1 hour.
"I must say, sir," Ivesk began indignantly, "all of this is highly irregular. If you had just included this in your previous documentation, we could have prepared adequately." The cables attached to Omvistus writhed as his body convulsed.
Your disquietude is counterproductive. Do I need to replace you?
Ivesk glanced around and stuttered. Of course not, sir." Licking his lips as he chose his next words, Ivesk tried to change the subject. "I noticed that you have some ambitious plans for our local starport. Would you care to elaborate?" Omvistus was motionless for several seconds, and then his shoulders rose slightly and his voice came through over the channel.
Your existing spaceport facility was insufficient for my needs.
"How so?"
The amount of raw materials that will need to be transported into orbit is an order of magnitude larger than what your current facilities are able to support. Additionally, I will be overseeing the construction of the 72 new spaceports my corporation requires, each located at key intersections across the surface of your world.
Ivesk could feel sweat trickling down the back of his neck and pretended to be rubbing sore muscles to wipe it away. He was relieved that Kolasa was still buried in the computer terminal, desperately trying to get evacuation notices out to the industrial sector. "Sir," he began, "while I appreciate your dedication to the development of Chessiet Prime, I feel it's my duty to inform you that the scale of the project is far beyond our capabilities. Building that many new spaceports would cost more than the total revenue our planet generates in a year." Omvistus twitched.
I have just purchased all the required materials to construct the new spaceports and arranged to have them delivered within the next 6 hours. You will prepare for their arrival at once.
The sheer amount of currency that had just changed hands before his very eyes, all in the span of a single heartbeat, left Ivesk speechless. His mind reeling with the mass of numbers, he tried to find his footing again. Thank you, sir. We'll make sure that the facilities are properly—"
You will not be responsible for their assembly. That process is entirely automated.
The Capsuleer's head twisted to one side, and his disembodied voice added,
All you need to do is stay out of the way.
Kolasa was pleading to Ivesk with her eyes, begging for the order to send out additional evacuation warnings to any citizens who currently lived or worked in the areas designated for immediate repurposing. She pointed to her vidscreen terminal, which showed numerous glowing red warnings all over the spinning image of the planet. The administrator, however, held one hand up, instructing her to wait. Omvistus, I must protest at this point. Most of the coordinates you've designated for these additional spaceports are located in densely populated areas. It's going to take more than a few hours to evacuate all those citizens. I demand more time. Omvistus was absolutely motionless.
You demand?
Frowning and leaning closer to the screen to block out the ambient noise of the city beyond the walls of the room, Ivesk refused to backpedal on an issue so important. We're talking about millions of people here. I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. He growled the final word. Sir? He shot an annoyed glance at Kolasa when the drone of something outside reached the point at which it was difficult to hear himself speak. We're going to need at least a week to relocate everyone to unaffected communities.
That sound you're hearing,
Omvistus replied,
is your planet's bombardment siren. You've probably never had to pay much attention to it in the past, seeing as your world is safely under the jurisdiction of Concord, but that is no longer the case.
As he spoke, the back window of the conference room took on a noticeably red tint, saturating the room in crimson light.
What you're seeing now is the targeting laser used to aim my battleship's 6 425mm railgun turrets. At this altitude, the gravity of your planet will augment the standard launch velocity of each solid projectile to speeds well beyond operational specifications, enough to obliterate anything within half a kilometer of the impact site.
Omvistus' image grew larger on the screen before he continued.
Anything between that location and 2 kilometers from ground zero will suffer a worse fate, as the antimatter suspended in each shell escapes its containment field and expands in a random dispersion pattern, colliding with the ambient normal matter on the ground. Buildings, trees, children, everything. Whatever these particles touch will experience matter dissociation on an atomic level as, piece by piece, they are reduced to unidentifiable residual particles.
He paused briefly and then concluded.
With a single thought, I can reduce your entire city to a smoldering crater. The boiling wind rushing in to replace the void left behind will be laced with dust particles that were once the bodies of everyone you know and love. Do you understand?
Ivesk looked down to see one of his hands shaking. He swallowed hard and, when next he spoke, his voice came out as a raspy whisper. I understand.
I'm sorry, Administrator Evesk, but I'm afraid I didn't catch your last words. Do you understand?
Yes. The red light faded, and, for the rest of the afternoon, the capsular spoke, and the planetary administrator listened with obedience. This concludes today's reading of Xenocracy. Thank you for listening. If you are interested in learning more about the rich history of the EVE universe, then please visit the EVE Chronicle site at community.eveonline.com/background/POTW. EVE Online and the EVE logo are the registered trademarks of CCP-HF. All rights are reserved worldwide. All other trademarks are the property of their respective owners. EVE Online, the EVE logo, EVE, and all associated logos and designs are the intellectual property of CCP-HF. All characters, vehicles, storylines, world facts, or other recognizable features of the intellectual property relating to these trademarks are likewise the intellectual property of CCP-HF. CCP-HF has granted permission to the EVE Reader podcast to use EVE Online and all associated logos and designs for promotional and informational purposes, but does not endorse and is in no way affiliated with the EVE Reader podcast. No official affiliation or endorsement by CCP Games HF is stated or implied.